The art of the master blender. Welcome to another episode of Erik Wait Whiskey Studies, and in this video I'm going to do a review of the Joseph Magnus Murray Hill Club bourbon whiskey. It is a blend. There are some whiskeys that are created to reflect a sense of place, focusing, say, on particular barleys or corns. And so when you get into the whiskey, what you're really experiencing is the producer's desire for you to experience that sense of place, or to borrow a French wine term, terroir. There are other whiskeys that want to emphasize the uniqueness of the stills, a lighter spirit, a more oily, shorter still. And then there are some that really want to emphasize the cask, that this distillery gets really high-end casks. But this whiskey is none of those. This whiskey is a reflection of the art, of the craftsmanship of the master blender. It's not that those other whiskeys don't involve a master blender or don't also reflect the handiwork of the master blender, but it's a matter of emphasis, of what are they trying to stress in the whiskey to bring you the greatest experience enjoying it. And this is definitely right, because these whiskeys, doing a three-part series of the whiskeys from Joseph Magnus, they're from Washington, D.C. They don't have a sense of place from Washington, D.C. The spirit itself comes from MGP. So they're not trying to emphasize what's coming from, the source of MGP. And yes, while they do use absolutely fantastic casks and superior casks, really the awesomeness of these whiskeys comes down to the craftsmanship, the artistry of the master blender. But before I get into reviewing this whiskey, here are my notes. Originally released in July 2016, this recreation of an 1890s pre-prohibition whiskey of the same name uses the same blending techniques and similar packaging as the original. Produced by Joseph A. Magnus and Company, the updated Murray Hill Club blended bourbon is made from a blend of three whiskeys: 20% 18-year-old bourbon, 50% 11-year-old bourbon, and 30% 9-year-old light whiskey. These three blends together meet the 51% minimum straight bourbon requirement to be classified as a blended bourbon. This is batch number 12, bottle 23 out of 700. It is bottled at 51.5% alcohol by volume, or 103 proof, and sells for anywhere between $90 and $150 here in the United States. Man, so when you think of bourbon, when I think of bourbon, immediately I automatically sort of conjure up a general profile of what is typical of a bourbon. Yeah, and then there can be some differences. Some, in terms of the mash bill, some might use a little bit more rye. Some will use a little bit more, say, of wheat. Some may use even different corn varieties to get a different profile. But generally speaking, there are things that are very typical of a bourbon. And what this whiskey really demonstrates is your mind doesn't go to, wow, they must have some really great corn, or they must have some really great cask, or some really great terroir, or anything of those other things. Your mind really goes, wow, whoever put this together did an absolutely superb job. And whatever stereotype you might have, what you think a bourbon is, this far surpasses it, because this is one of the most spectacular, most superb bourbons I have ever had. It's got more layers it's got those sort of big, robust aromas, and then it's got those more nuanced, subtle aromas that are sort of hovering underneath and above. Yes, it's got some classic, caramel corn, butterscotch, vanilla, cinnamon, nutmeg, all those typical profiles that you can hear about in every bourbon. And yet it's the way in which it's put together, like a beautiful song, like a poem, like a well-crafted story. This bourbon comes together because you get these sort of more bass notes, you get some of the high notes, and in the middle as well. And so there's a layers of complexity to it that remind me of, even though they don't taste or smell like a Scotch, but they are layered like a fine Scotch, or layered like a fine cognac, or layered like a fine Burgundy. Not in terms of aromas and flavors, but in the structure and the way it's put together. I get toffee, I actually get some floral notes, and I don't hear that as a descriptor for bourbons very often. The butter notes. There is butter popcorn that uses the fake butter, the acetal, and then there's butter or popcorn that uses real butter, genuine butter, and that's what I get in this. It's sweet on the nose, and yet there's also some slight savory notes as well. It's got just a slight earthiness. And I don't say this a lot about bourbons, but this is one in which you can just sit there and smell and smell and smell, go back to it over and over and over again, and keep getting something more out of it. In terms of, not only in terms of what is there, but how it's being delivered to your nose. All right, on the palate. Usually I immediately jump straight into a second sip. I take a sip to sort of, without thinking about it. I don't analyze the first sip. Sort of use the first sip to sort of, shock the palate, and then take a second sip and then analyze that one. But this bourbon so much grabs your attention that to immediately jump into a second sip seems like you're sort of robbing yourself of the experience of the first sip. Like you need to take a sip and just meditate on that one and just think about that one even before going on to the second sip. But let's get on with it. Not only all of these have all kinds of layers of aromas and flavors, but textures and mouthfeel as well. So it has like classic bourbon notes, of caramel corn, butter, cinnamon, nutmeg, baking spices, loads of vanilla, but it's very seductive in the way in which it goes across your palate. It is one of the most complex bourbons I've ever had. It has one of the greatest evolutions of a bourbon that I've ever had. There's a lightness and delicateness to it, but then there's this boldness and power that comes on the finish. So it starts off sort of light and fresh and fruity with like apples, cinnamon, a little bit of peach cobbler, and then the vanilla, the caramels, the toffee. There's a sweetness there. There's also a slight savory note there as well, almost like a slight barbecue rub. And then the vanilla and the caramels come in the back end. And it sort of starts off sort of light and airy and delicate and very gentle, and sort of ramps up in its power and strength into the finish. Absolutely superb. There are people who mostly into whiskeys and like a bourbon on occasion. I'm probably in that camp. There are people who they're 90% into bourbons and have a Scotch on occasion. If you are a bourbon lover and most of your whiskeys that you have are bourbons and you're really into bourbons, and if you haven't had this one, this is an absolute must buy. Now, these aren't inexpensive, but I would say there are those other whiskeys, and you know who I'm referring to, that sell for, bourbons $1,000 that get a lot of hype to them, right? Forget those. I've tasted those, right? Forget those. This one is one you want to buy. This is a very high-end, high-quality bourbon. Yeah, it might be, in comparison to your $30 to $40 budget bourbons, a little bit up there. But if you're a bourbon lover, you should have at least one special occasion bourbon to have on your shelf to celebrate with. Birthdays, anniversaries, weddings, whatever it is you're celebrating, right? Have one of these on your shelf at all times, because I know I will, right? This is an absolutely spectacular bourbon, and in addition to their say main bottlings, from now on, I know I will always have one of these on my shelf, because this is absolutely superb. And this is one in which anybody who perhaps sticks their nose up at bourbon, you know, because they're a Scotch snob, I'm gonna say, dude, try this. Seriously. I'm going to give this bourbon 95 points. 95 points. And it's a contender, and it's going to be a tough year this year in 2020. It's a contender for one of my top 10 for 2020. Absolutely superb. Now, if you've had this whiskey, I would like to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment down below. And if you disagree with me, let me know as well. All right, if you're one of my patrons, I want to thank you very much for joining my little group. And if you haven't subscribed already, but you like watching my videos, I would greatly appreciate it if you would subscribe. Give this video a thumbs up and share with your friends on Facebook, Twitter, and other social networking channels. And don't forget to ring the bell to be notified when I go live or post a new video. All right, until next time, cheers. Hey, don't forget to subscribe and check out these other whiskey videos.